This is an URPE session, the Union for Radical Political Economics session on topics in macroeconomics. It's in deference to the English-speaking audience that we are going to speak in English and not in Portuguese, given that this is an old Portuguese speaking panel. I think with the exception of Marvel, all had some passage through the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, my alma mater. The topics are, and the reason I should say for this very unsexy title for the session is that they are broadly speaking on macroeconomic issues, but they don't have a common thread. So I'm going to briefly present the speakers. I'm going to be the last one to speak. I'm going to give 20 minutes to everybody. I should say that, contrary to other sessions, for those that are the attendees, you do have the ability to use the chat. So you can use the chat or the Q&A to ask questions, and we will have plenty of time at the end for that. I will be given to the panelists, through the chat, some notices about the time of their talk. So the first panelist would be Joanna Britzer, and her paper will be Debt-led Growth and Its Financial Fragility. I apologize, Joanna. I know that you started teaching, but now my memory and I don't have the thing in front of me. So, you tell them where you just been hired. I truly apologize for that.
So I should tell now. So actually, I was supposed to start on a position at Connecticut College, but because of ongoing visa restrictions, I have not been able to take that up yet. Okay,
so you're like Marvel to some extent at Bucknell. So, well, I hope that gets resolved. So one more issue to get, now that I'm going to talk a little bit about COVID. And certainly what to expect from the new government. One more thing to be fixed. So we also have papers on I should say, by Gabriel Aidar on fiscal policy and on growth and the environment by Marvel. Mine will be about public debt, also going back to fiscal policy to some extent, although I'm going to talk about several other things, and the COVID crisis. So that's essentially the panel. So Joanna, if you want 20 minutes, I'll let you know when you have 5 and 1 minute.
Okay, thank you very much. Is it possible to see the screen now? Okay. So thank you very much for this opportunity to be presenting here. Thank you very much, Matthias, for organizing this session. So the title of my presentation is Debt-led Growth and Its Financial Fragility. And it is part of my PhD dissertation that I have recently defended at the New School for Social Research under the supervision of Professor Mark Satterfield. And I work throughout my dissertation on demand-led growth theories and its relationship with income distribution, but trying to incorporate that household debt finance consumption into this relationship between growth and income distribution. And specifically this chapter, this paper, was a theoretical contribution to debate, asking the question if this sort of debt-led growth model, where you have that financed consumption as sort of the autonomous component of demand that drives growth, is that a model that is financially sustainable from the perspective of these households that are going into debt. So it's kind of trying to think a little bit in terms of the implications of some of Satterfield and Kim's work, but now thinking about a type of super multiplier model where we have this debt finance consumption being the driver of demand-led growth. So as I said, then the purpose of the paper is to explore the financial sustainability of certain types of demand-led growth models that take household credit finance consumption as the main driver of growth. And the way that I've organized the paper and this presentation is, first I'll do sort of a review on demand-led growth theories, mostly of course focusing on this debt financed consumption type of theories, and also thinking about how did I incorporate this in what I suggested as a model. Then I'll suggest my own model in terms of demand-led growth with household debt finance consumption as the autonomous component of demand. And here you'll see that it's quite similar to the work that has already been done by Pariboni. And then which is actually the main contribution of this paper, is to actually discuss the financial sustainability of such model, here really based on the work that was done by Satterfield and Kim, where they discuss the financial sustainability of their models, but thinking about sort of a neo-Kaleckian framework. So in terms of neo-Kaleckian growth theory, we know we have that investment is the autonomous component of demand, so that when we try to incorporate household consumption, it always needs to be determined by current income, right? And there's a few attempts to do that. And here I'll focus mostly on that attempt because it relates to what I've done in terms of what I suggested in model and in the Satterfield and Kim approach, because it allows for this analysis of the financial sustainability of such growth models. So in terms of Dut's model, what we have then is that, well, investment, as we know, follows sort of a Badurian-Margolin approach, but the worker consumption is assumed to have a component that is determined by current income, right? So it's this first term here in the equation, and then a part of it that is financed by debt. So it's you consume out of debt, and the way that endogenizes this debt finance component to the current income is that it works with a debt target, and then this debt target, in the second equation we have then that the debt target is going to be determined by current income. So then you have that consumption, workers' consumption is still fully determined by current income. Then in the Satterfield and Kim model, we have something similar. So we also have workers' consumption being determined by, or being partially determined by current income, but then a part of it is debt finance. And then this debt finance is going to be determined by their consumption target. And the idea here is that then what households are doing when consuming is that they are constantly adjusting their consumption to a consumption target, but this consumption target is endogenized to rentiers' income in the sense that you think they are always trying to keep up with what rentiers are consuming, and we have then that the consumption target is being determined by this emulation effect, by following whatever rentiers' households are doing, so that we endogenize consumption, workers' consumption to total income, and then we can continue to have a type of investment function of the Badurian-Margolin where we have investment as the autonomous component of demand. So this provides some interesting theoretical approaches. It does allow us for an stability analysis, because if in the Dutch model we had that is fully determined by households' current income, so we didn't really have a possibility for an analysis of the stability from the perspective of the household. But when we look at the Satterfield and Kim model, we see that because it's determined by the consumption target, which is determined by rentiers' income, then this model allows us to have a stability analysis of this debt to income ratio from the perspective of the workers, which is very interesting. And then what we have as well in terms of the Paley and Pariboni's sort of critique to the approach that neo-Kaleckian models have incorporated that finance consumption into a neo-Kaleckian model is that, well, in the end, we always need to have the consumption, even if it's debt finance, it needs to be endogenized to current income, right? Because otherwise the model just doesn't close. So you need that to be endogenized. And so the idea here is that to think about a model that allows us to think of consumption or debt finance consumption to be completely autonomous, then we would need an approach, something like the supermultiplier model, which is what I will be presenting now. So in terms of a supermultiplier growth model, what we have is that in this model, investment is not the autonomous component of demand. It allows for then us to consider the possibility of other components of demand as the drivers of growth. And it has been suggested that this could be government expenditure, or it could be credit finance, workers, credit finance consumption. And there has been an attempt by Pariboni following Freitas and Serrano to suggest that the autonomous component of demand can be thought of as households' expenditure financed by credit. So that would be then sort of the driver of growth under a supermultiplier model. And in sort of a similar approach, we also have this idea of a semi-autonomous consumption, where we have that households' consumption credit finance, or in the case of, for example, of Brochier and Silva, we have an idea that the household consumption is semi-autonomous because it's determined by past accumulation of wealth. So it's not fully exogenous, but it's still autonomous, and it's still being sort of the driver of growth, what Lavoie then has called it the semi-autonomous component of demand. So what we suggest then here is to assume that consumption that is similar to other models that we have here. We suggest that consumption is going to be divided into workers' consumption and rentiers' consumption. Rentiers' consumption is fully determined by their current income, but then workers' consumption is going to have a part of it that is fully determined by their income, by wages, but then a part of it is going to be autonomous, is not going to be determined by their current income. And the idea then is that households, they can either save, and then this SWT will be positive, so they will be taking income out of consumption, or they can get into debt, and then what we'll have then is that income will be added into consumption, and this income is not determined by current income, right? It's households getting into debt so that they can consume beyond their wages. So then the suggestion here is to think about a model that allows either for households to save or for households to dissave, to get into debt, and then a model then where this savings decision is not determined by their current income, and that then allows for this SW, or could be savings, or could be accumulation of debt, or H dot as we're going to call it. Then it allows it to be autonomous, and then being the driver of growth in a sort of a super multiplier model of growth, right? So the idea then in this analysis, in what we've suggested, previously here, is then that the autonomous component of demand is going to be explained by the SWT. So either it's going to be by households taking out of income and saving, or by them accumulating debt. And what we'll see is that this model is actually going to require for households to accumulate debt in order for the economy to keep on growing. And what we see is actually a result that is more or less similar to Pariboni's result, that the rate of growth of capital accumulation and it's going to be determined by the rate of growth of the autonomous component of demand, which is then this part of consumption that will be debt finance. But what I actually am interested in looking at is, well, if I have this type of growth model, then what is going to be, how is in steady state this ratio of total accumulated debt over accumulated capital, what is this ratio going to behave in steady state? So what I actually want to look at is then this last ratio that I defined in the slide, where I'm calling it the ratio of debt to capital, if households are accumulating debt, or it could also be the wealth to capital if households will be accumulating wealth in the steady state. But the idea then is to look at this and then compare this with an idea of financial stability for this type of model. So what we then think about is, well, I want to look at this ratio. So how is this ratio behaving in steady state? So how is the ratio of debt to capital behaving in the steady state, and how will this compare to an idea of a maximum ratio that households can get? And this idea of maximum comes from Satterfield and Kim work, where they define this maximum of debt that households can work with as an amount of debt at which households are using all of their income just to be able to service their debt, right? So beyond that point, it becomes financially unsustainable for households to continue in this model. So the idea then is to compare this idea of a ratio with a model where then this credit finance consumption is driving growth in a model as we've described in this slide, right? So I want to look at then this ratio and compare it with a maximum level of debt or debt to capital ratio. So this is the graphical analysis here. What I plotted is then how is the ratio changing. So this is really just a graph that differential equation graph that really just plots the behavior. So how much is the ratio changing is on the y-axis, and the actual ratio is on the x-axis. And really what I'm looking at is just really the movement of d dot against d. And what I see then is a negative relationship for this differential equation. And this implies then that, and here I'm assuming when the economy is growing. So these are the sort of the data for when the economy is growing at 3%, right? So if the autonomous component of demand is growing at 3%, this is what I have. And here in terms of the analysis, what we see is that it's negatively sloped, which means then that the stability of the steady state converges to a point of stability. And this point of stability requires households to be on a negative D. So the stability of the model takes households to a point where they will be accumulating debt as opposed to wealth. So for us to have a positive rate of growth in the model that we just described, we'll need households to accumulate that, and that ratio is going to be defined here as the point where this ratio stops changing in the fully steady state position of the graph. And if I look at the same dynamics, but assuming a positive rate of growth, what I'll see here is that households will be facing assuming that the economy is facing economic recession, that the GDP is decreasing. So it's decreasing at 1%. What I have is a positive slope dynamics. That means that the dynamics is unstable. So unless I am at the point of stability, there is nothing in the model that will take me to the point of stability. And if I am at the point of stability, then what I'll have, the point of stability is giving me that households are accumulating wealth. So households are saving and accumulating wealth as opposed to accumulating debt, if I'm assuming that the economy is not growing, so it's degrowing at 1%. So this is an interesting result. It requires that for us to have a positive rate of growth, I'll need households to be accumulating debt. And if I'm going to have a negative rate of growth, then households will be accumulating, they will be saving, they will be accumulating wealth under this fully sort of steady state analysis. And this is an steady state that is unstable. So unless I'm at it, I'm not going to converge to it. While the previous one where I had a positive rate of growth with households accumulating that actually generated a position that is sort of stable, at least just in fully mathematical terms. So this is what it looks like if I think about the different types of rates of growth. So this is a 3D graph. And here what I have, so when I move the mouse, you don't see it moving in the slide, right? Do you see it? No. So yeah, so I'll have to. Oh,
well, you do see it. Well, at least I see it.
Okay, so that's good. So what I have here then is, once again, that the change in D is plotted against DT. So this is the many different ratios plotted, the change in the ratio plotted against the actual ratio. And this is for the different rates of growth of the economy. So for the different rates of growth of the autonomous component of demand being positive and negative. And this is what we have, right? So if we assume a rate of growth that is negative for the autonomous component of demand, we'll have a dynamic that is unstable because it's positive. And then for positive rates of growth, I have a dynamic that is actually stable in this model. But as we saw, it requires households to accumulate debt. So, and plotting then this for another graph, another way to look at it is, so this graph here is plotting the equilibrium level of the ratio for the different rates of growth. So on the x-axis, I have the different rates of growth, while on the y-axis, I have the equilibrium point for this ratio of debt to capital. And what I see then is that for positive rates of growth, I always require that households are accumulating. So the model, the stability of the model requires that I converge to a point where households are accumulating debt. So they converge to a negative ratio of debt to capital. And this gray line here is what we've defined to be the Dmax. So the maximum amount of debt that households would accumulate. So then what we're showing here is that actually, so what we have is that the economy is, for it to grow, we need households to accumulate this debt ratio. So it needs to have, we need to have a negative wealth or debt to capital ratio. And what we see is that for rates of growth that are positive but not too high, this fully steady state position will be beyond the point, the maximum point that households can service, right? So this the DT, or the DT of fully equilibrium, makes the model go beyond the Dmax here that we had defined, that we have plotted here in the gray line. So what we have is that for the economy to grow at positive but not too high rates of growth, the equilibrium point, or the fully adjusted position, has the model has a ratio of debt to household, debt to capital for households that is beyond a financially sustainable level or ratio for households. So in terms of the final remarks, then what we found, well, the model converges, the fully steady state position of the model is given by the rate of growth of the credit finance part. It is sort of embedded in the assumptions of the model that has to be like that. And what we found then is we looked at the different debt to capital ratios for the different rates of growth. And what we found is that for positive rates of growth, for the economy to grow at positive rates of growth, I need households to accumulate that, so that the fully stable position of the model will require households to accumulate that, just mathematically speaking. But that when I have positive rates of growth that are below 2.6, what I'll observe is that this fully adjusted, in mathematical terms, this fully adjusted position of equilibrium will require households to accumulate a debt that is not financially sustainable, because they will not even be able to service their debt after a certain time. So that's it. Thank you. And yeah, those are my contacts. Sorry. Thank you.
I have to unmute myself. The most repeated phrase in the last year, apparently. And thank you for, you did a great job on time, so we have more than enough time. So our second panelist is Gabriel Aidar. Gabriel is finishing his PhD at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. He's also an economist at the National Development Bank in Brazil. And he will be presenting a paper on fiscal policy rules, tax incidence, conflicting claims over distribution, and disruption supermultiplier. So we had the Kaleckian, the Kaleckian growth model, and now we have, I suppose, the other one would be the supermultiplier in a context here in which we'll discuss some of those fiscal policies. So I'll do the same thing. I'll give you the 5-minute warning and a 5-minute, you'll see it through the chat. So, I'll also put my hand up so that you might see. So Gabriel, please.
Thank you, Matias. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm very happy to participate for the first time in the American Economic Association annual meeting. So I'm very happy to present my work here. I have just to share my screen.
It's probably your first time in Chicago too.
Yes, indeed. Well, I'm sorry for that. You all can see, right? The presentation. Okay. So this work is the final chapter of my PhD dissertation. Is actually, I must say, a preliminary work, which I'm still working on it. So it's the first presentation of this model. And of course, I will welcome any comments and suggestions that may come up from you. So in the presentation, I will briefly introduce the work to contextualize what I'm doing. And then I will discuss, some basic notions of taxation in a simple graph and supermultiplier model. Actually, I'm here working only with steady state positions, equilibrium position. I'm not analyzing the transition period of the supermultiplier. So in other terms, I'm assuming the investment rate as in its equilibrium level, so it's fixed. And then the core of this presentation is the discussion on indirect taxation and distributive conflict. And after that, I will discuss some of the implications of tax incidence and shift in taxations to equilibrium output in this context of the graph and supermultiplier, and then I conclude. Well, just to compare to, because in my research, in my dissertation, I'm also looking at the fiscal policy and state intervention in classical theory. And it's important to say that in classical theory, for a given preference, technology and factor endowments, that the factor substitution principle will ensure the full employment of factors of production, right? So under these circumstances, state intervention in all these forms is assessed in terms of its allocative effect under the traditional Paretian criteria. So states should intervene ex post through supply of public goods, tax, subsidies, and so on and so forth, when markets are absent or when they fail to generate this Paretian efficient outcome. Well, from our standpoint, the classical surplus approach, as revived by Rafa, Gariani, and others, we start from the analytical separation between the determination of distribution and relative prices, and of course, the levels of output. So the usual Pareto criteria and the notions of allocative distortions breaks down once the new classical explanation of distribution and the tendency toward full employment are abandoned. So in this framework, the state plays a role both in the determination of the social surplus, in the accumulation process, and in the distribution of the surplus through the taxations, transfer subsidies, and etc. And here I'm especially looking at taxation. So the aim of the work consists of assessing the impact of taxation and demand-led model with distributive conflict. There is, of course, a broad literature of supply-multiply models with taxation and government spending. I mentioned a few here. However, the interaction of tax incidence and the distributive conflict are less frequently found in the literature. We have some work from Metcalfe and Seidman in the 70s in this Raffian framework. We have both in Stellar in, well, actually it's 1994 in more Neo-Kaleckian model. And then we have Ito in Nell's book from the 80s. So we include the indirect taxation, a simple version of this Raffian super multiplier, and we explicit the interaction of taxation and distribution. Why I'm talking about indirect taxation? Because it's hugely important to the developing world. If I take OECD data, more than 50% of tax revenues in Latin America came from consumption or value-added taxes, while in OECD average, you have around 33%. Of course, the different assumptions regarding determination of real wage and the rate of profits will be considered. And finally, we provide a brief assessment of some options of public policy to accommodate the conflict claim over income in the context of indirect taxation. So very briefly, tax revenues here are divided in income tax and indirect tax. The income tax is the traditional formula of the tax rate on wages times the wages in the economy and the tax rate on profits. And then we add a third component, which is the revenues of indirect taxation. By now, we assume a fixed tax burden of indirect taxation in terms of GDP. And when we see the GDP, it can be divided in the wage share. Here is the gross wage share before the income tax, the gross profit share before income tax, and the indirect tax burden. And I can rewrite the equation of the tax revenue as you see in equation 5, right? Well, the consumption function, I'm assuming here it's different from Joanna. I assume the autonomous, the capitalist consumption as an autonomous demand, purely autonomous, and workers consume out of wages, right? Net of income tax. The investment function is the traditional one, and as I said, I am assuming the investment rate. Sorry, investment is induced, and I'm assuming the investment rate in its equilibrium position, so it won't move in the exercise of the model. And finally, I adopt a third assumption, assuming that governments follow a fiscal rule. They try to balance the budget over time. Of course, no government by now is running, balanced budgets. Everybody now is doing deficits, as we discussed in the beginning of this presentation. But I'm assuming this assumption here. First, for simplicity, because I'm not analyzing the dynamics of public debt, so I must to assume balanced budget. And secondly, we must not forget that in the developing world, talking about Brazil, from where I come from, the fiscal rules are still in the order of the day. So fiscal rules are still in place. Although we are running deficit, we still have the fiscal rules, and the government talking about fiscal adjustment after the pandemic crisis. So the equilibrium between output and aggregate demand is given by equation 7. Here, because I assume that governments follow a balanced budget rule, I have only capitalist consumptions as autonomous consumption. And the effects of the increasing the income tax burden, assuming a fixed pre-tax distribution, are the same found in the literature, such as the work of Allen in 2015 and Serrano and Pimentel. So the rising of the tax rate on wage income and the tax rate on profit to income have a positive effect on the level, on the equilibrium level of output. And this is a very known result that the increase in the income tax rate on workers raises the equilibrium level of output because the government purpose of spending is higher than the demand leakage caused by the increase in the tax rates. This the famous Havelman result. The increase in our model, the increase in the income tax on capital does not cause any demand leakage. And now we move to the indirect tax rates because so far we assumed it's fixed, and we have now to consider the effects of a tax rate shift on distribution. That's the main difference when you're talking about indirect taxation. So in order to assess the interaction of distribution and indirect tax, the Israeli system of price of productions with a uniform rate of profit is assumed. For simplistic capital is homogeneous, I'm considering capital homogeneous, and the labor unit costs is a sufficient approximation to normal unit costs. Hence, we can rewrite the price of production in terms of the cost plus equation, as you probably know, and we are assuming, also for simplicity, a homogeneous indirect tax rate in the among the different sectors of the economy. So the indirect taxation here, which can be understood as a value-added tax, is simply added by firms to the unit costs they are charging and the gross profit margin. So the equation is given is the equation 8, is the same one that Moth and Slattery work in their work. Theta here stands for the gross profit margin. W is the nominal wage. B is the labor output coefficient. I can rewrite equation 8 replacing the profit margin by the normal rate of profit. But here, something important to stress, the profit margin will depend not only on the normal rate of profit, but also on the indirect tax rate. So it's the gross, let's say the gross normal rate of profit, which determines the margin, the gross margin profit. So of course, the incidence of indirect tax will depend on the response of firms to an increase in the tax rate. I can draw the wage frontier is the same thing that Metcalfe and Steedman did in the 70s from this equation, and it's very clear. We can see that the wage frontier is shifted to the left. That means that the social surplus available for profits and wages is reduced because the state is appropriating of a part of the value added in production, right? So we can have three situations here, which is it's very obvious, right? The real wage can be endogenous to changes in the rate of profit and the tax rate. The normal profit rate can be endogenous to changes in the tax rate or the real wage, or the tax rate can be endogenous to changes in distribution. But here, I must stress this number 3, it's more of a decision of the government. It's not an economic relation among capitalists and workers. It's much more about the decision of the governments regarding the current state of the economy. And we know, speaking of developing economies, these indirect tax rates are all the times changing in order to accommodate some of interest in the economic sector. So let's do 2 exercises here. First one, let's assume that the normal rate of profit is fixed exogenously. In that case, a rise in the nominal wage above labor productivity will be necessarily passed on by firms, which will maintain the profit margin in order to preserve their net normal rate of profit. The question 9 is clear about that. In this case, price will increase proportionally to wages, and nothing will change in terms of distribution or the tax burden. A second exercise consists of an increase in the tax rate by the government. As it is clear from our wage frontier, the curve will dislocate to the left, reducing the net surplus after the indirect tax. I just coming back. It's if I increase the tax rate, I will have a further shift to the left of the wage frontier curve. In that case, price will increase more than proportionally to the change in the tax rate because the margin profit depend on the tax rate, and the normal rate of profit will be fixed, will be constant. We'll have then a fall in the real wage and the wage share, since we assume the fixed labor coefficient. Therefore, in a situation with a fixed normal rate of profit, the real incidence of a rise in the tax rate, or the indirect tax rate, will be on real wages. So the workers, in the end of the story, the workers pay for the increase in taxation. Well, a third option would be following the monetary theory of distribution. Of course, Pivetti here is the main reference. We can consider the situation in which the normal rate of profit is defined by two components: the real interest rate, determined by the nominal interest rate fixed by the monetary authority, and the rate of profit of enterprise, which is the rate of profit associated to the risk and trouble of each activity. We can now consider that the profit of enterprise is the endogenous variable. And of course, in this case, the nominal profit rate becomes the endogenous variable to change in the real wage and the tax rate. It is clear that if workers succeed in bargaining a higher real wage, the rate of profit of enterprise and the normal rate of profit will fall if the government keeps the tax rate fixed. It's worth noting that a further possibility of an endogenous rate of profit is possible if the government keeps the nominal rate fixed, whereas the nominal rates are increasing. We can check from equation 9 that the rate of profit will decrease, because in that case the real interest rate is falling. And finally, it's worth noticing that in the case of a drop in the real interest rate, the government can restore the original normal rate of profit, simply raising the basic nominal interest rate, so real wages will fall, and again, the real tax incidence will lay on wages. One last possibility, one last exercise, when the government tries to accommodate the distributive conflict. We have already evaluated the case in which the government raised the nominal interest rate in order to preserve the fixed normal rate of profit, which is of course in favor of capitalists. But the government could also spend on subsidies for the economic sectors or cut the income tax rate on profit. In the first situations, subsidies, the government would preserve the normal rate of profit, which is fixed, while in the second situation of cutting the income tax on profits, the normal rate of profit would fall, but the net profit share after direct and indirect taxes would be the original one, would be fixed. Finally, in light of a higher bargaining power of workers and a fixed normal rate of profit, the government could choose to cut the indirect tax rate, and this would be equivalent to a shift to the right of our wage frontier, and it would correspond to a smaller share of social surplus being appropriated by the state, which does that in order to accommodate the conflicting claims over income. So let's see the impacts, the implications in terms of output of the shift in taxation. So return to our simple version of the supermultiplier model and under balanced budgets. This is always important to stress, to check the effect of an increase in the indirect tax on the level of output. Again, for simplicity, we'll consider that the rise in the indirect tax rate will be equivalent to an increase in the indirect tax burden. We will consider the situation where the wage share is endogenous to the shift in the indirect tax, as we see in the exercise in our examples, and we can rewrite equation 4 as the wage share in terms of the profit share. I'm here talking about gross profit share, gross wage share, minus the indirect tax burden. If I replace that in the equation of equilibrium output and check for the effect of an increase of the indirect tax burden, I see that different from the case of income tax, here the positive effects of a rising of the increase in the indirect tax burden will depend on the parameters of the propensity to consume and the tax rate on workers. Because the real incidence of the increase in the tax rate here is over the real wage, as we discussed, and this will affect both the multiplier and the tax burden on income. Therefore, the increase the indirect tax burden under balanced budgets will be expansionary only the situation where the propensity to spend out of wages and the tax rates on wages are not too big. Next, we will consider what happens to the equilibrium output in case the workers have enough bargaining power to increase wages and the government choose to accommodate this increase, reducing the indirect tax rate. Again, under balanced budget, and I'm here assuming the normal rate of profit constant. So here, the endogenous variable is the indirect tax rate. If again, if here I consider the impact of an increase in the wage share, I can check that, and this is important result of the simple model. I cannot assure that the impact of the increase of the wage share will be always positive. It will depend on the parameters, will depend positively on the size of the propensity to consume out of wages and the tax burden on wage income. Because here the increase of the wage share has a negative effect in the indirect tax burden. So when I raise wage share here, the states the governments choose to accommodate the raise in the wage share by reducing the indirect tax rate, and so maintaining the normal rate of profit of capitalists. And if the propensity to consume out of net wages and the tax rate on wages are not high enough, the increase in the wage share can even reduce the equilibrium output in the context, again, of balanced budgets. And this occurs, of course, because the government is trying to accommodate the conflicting claims over distribution. Well, a third government policy, sorry.
So try to go, we're at 20 minutes. I don't know if you saw there. So try to go to conclusions as soon as you can.
Oh, sorry. Okay, it's okay, only 2 slides more. So one last possibility is the government to provide, instead of cutting indirect tax, the state to provide free public service, such as public health, education, leisure, and etc. Cesarato nominates that the provision of social wage by the state. It actually consists of reducing the cost of basic goods that are part of workers' social determined subsistence wage. In the Jaffe price equation, it means that some basic goods will now be free, and this will increase the total surplus of the economy. So our wage frontier will it will move to the right. Hence, for a fixed normal rate of profit and balanced budget, this increase in total surplus accommodates both the tax burden necessary to finance spending and not reducing the wage share in the social surplus. So, briefly concluding, well, the introduction of indirect taxation and the alternative options of accommodation by the government emphasize the role of state in the end determining distribution and output. Here, I'm only talking about the level of output. We show that the real incidence depends on the assumption, the real incidence of indirect taxation depends on the assumption regarding distribution, which is partially exogenous here, as in the Israeli system, and different from the case of income tax. In the case of indirect taxation, the impact of a rise in tax burden depends on values of the workers' propensity to consume and the income tax rate. And the increase in the wage share can be ambiguous depending on the size of this parameter as well. Well, I'm now working on relaxing the assumption of balanced budgets, which will bring much more complexity to the discussion, and considering a feedback from unemployment to wage bargaining and check the dynamic. This is the next step. So I thank you. I'm sorry for the time.
So thank you, Gabriel. So we now switched. We had a neo-Kaleckian model of demand-led growth, of course, that emphasized issues of debt and financial fragility. Then a super multiplier model that emphasized the issues of taxation and income distribution. And now we will look at I assume also an heterodox growth model that emphasizes environmental issues. So Marvil Davila, that recently, I assume it's recently, so you correct me, got his PhD from the University of Siena and has been hired by Bucknell University, although given all the COVID and Trump complications, it's still in Italy. Like Joanna, so it's a very cohesive panel in many ways. So Marvil will present on how do you feel about going green. Marvil, I'll put my hand too, so that sometimes those chats are not fully visible.
Thank you, Matthias. Just interrupt me if I'm extrapolating the time. So share. And now let me see if do you see my screen?
See, we are going Caldorian. So now we have all kinds of models.
Yeah. Now we have the La Trinidad. We have Rafa, Kalecki, and now we have Calder. We should have Calder. So thank you again, dear professors and colleagues, for having me today. The title of my presentation is How do you feel about going green, environmental sentiments, and Tirol's law? So I would like to start saying that climate change is real, and there is an almost global consensus among the scientific community that human activities are to blame. Still, there seems to be, the general public seems to be divided between those who accept and those who are skeptical to the environmental challenge. And to the extent that there are different beliefs and attitudes towards climate policies, it's not an exaggeration to say that climate change has also become a social phenomenon. In a recent review of the literature, Capstick and co-authors have identified some interesting trends in international public opinion on the topic. They identified an initial phase of increasing knowledge and awareness that goes from the 80s until the mid-2000s, followed by polarization of viewpoints within and between nations afterwards. So, to the best of our knowledge, a comprehensive assessment of those trajectories that takes into account the interaction of environmental variables and the macroeconomy is still missing. And it's our purpose in this paper to attempt to try to provide an assessment of these issues, to fill this gap in the literature by developing a small-scale agent-based model that highlights that agents always or frequently engage in motivated reasoning, and therefore communication is context dependent. Now, the two main bridges connecting the environment and the macroeconomy are going to be the green version of Tirol's law and the so-called Porter's hypothesis. For those who are not familiar with Tirol's law, it's one of the most powerful empirical regularities among alternative theories of growth and distribution. It has a very simple intuition. Suppose imports M, here imports, depend on domestic income, Y, while exports X depend on foreign demand, Y star. In a small open economy, if in the long run equilibrium in trade, equilibrium in the balance of payments is a requirement, then at some point we should expect that the rate of growth of output should adjust to the rate of growth of exports. Now, the green version of the law basically states that exports also depend on a component that captures environmental efficiency. And the idea is that products that are in the technological frontier, or goods that are in the technological frontier, they are also more environmental efficiency. So an increase in environmental efficiency is associated with an increase in non-price competitiveness. And finally, Porter's hypothesis, the main idea behind Porter's hypothesis is basically that environmental regulation can actually foster competitiveness. We will come back to this later. So what is the contribution of the paper? The paper brings a contribution from an empirical point of view and from a theoretical point of view. In this presentation, I will concentrate myself in the second part. But from an empirical point of view, to the best of our knowledge, we are the first to provide estimates on the green version of Hero's Law, and we do this for a sample of 12 OECD countries between 1997 and 2014. And we make use of panel co-integration techniques. Among our findings, we have that Australia and the UK seem to be falling behind in implementing green solutions in comparison to the other countries of our sample. Now, from a theoretical point of view, we are going to present a two-dimensional nonlinear discrete time agent-based model on the interplay between attitudes towards climate policies and the macroeconomy, emphasizing, and here I repeat myself, that sentiments, environmental sentiments, are context dependent. Now, let's start presenting briefly some of our results in the empirical part. We basically have an exports function. This is the first equation. Exports are a Cobb-Douglas function of foreign demand and environmental efficiency, while imports just depend on domestic income. And here for the small open economy, we have the balance of payments equilibrium condition when the exchange rate, the real exchange rate, for simplicity is taken as constant and equal to 1. So after some algebraical manipulations, we have that the rate of growth of output compatible with equilibrium in the balance of payments can be approximated by the ratio between the rate of growth of exports and the income elasticity of imports, when the rate of growth of exports can be disaggregated between a foreign demand component and an environmental efficiency component. How we estimate the green version of Hero's Law? We basically take logarithmics of the first and the second equation, and we estimate these two equations. In this paper, we make use of panel co-integration techniques, the dynamic ordinary least squares estimator. I'm not going to present the results here. I just wanted to show that we are quite confident in using Hero's Law, or the green version of Hero's Law, as one of the connecting bridges in our model, because we have that actual and predicted growth rates are quite close. So here Y corresponds to the actual long-run rate of growth, and YBB to the predicted rates of growth by the model, and they are quite close. So now let's go to the model. And a crucial aspect of the model is the reasoning is context dependent. And the point is the individuals don't live in mountains isolated from one from another. So we're surrounded by a community, and we share worldviews. So our reasoning happens in a given context. We share these visions of the world, these worldviews with this context, and we make use of associative reasoning, analytic reasoning. The combination of these elements leads to motivational reasoning. Motivational reasoning can be of two types. Agents can be accurate motivated. Agents can also be directional motivated. What is accuracy motivation? Well, the individual is actually looking for the truth. I'm actually looking to find the truth, so to speak, but I trust different sources of information differently. So, for example, my mother wants to find the truth, but she trusts her pastor more than she trusts a professor, a researcher. While I trust more the researcher than I trust the Pope. This is an example of accuracy motivation. Directional motivation, I have a commitment with a previous result, and I select the sources of information depending on if the source supports or does not support a previous conclusion I already reached. So it is a combination of this mechanism that result in a given attitude towards something. In this case, attitudes towards a climate policies, attitudes towards climate change. How can we model this? So suppose that the population is divided between two groups, and here I'm not going to present every aspect of the model, just the main equation, so you can get a flavor of the narrative we have in mind. So suppose the population N is divided between two groups, N plus and N minus. N plus are those who support climate change policies or believe in climate change. N minus are those the deniers. They don't believe or they just oppose climate policies. So small n is defined as the difference between these two groups. And in this way, we're able to build an index phi that goes between -1 and 1. So if all the population supports climate policies, phi is equal to 1. If all the population opposes climate policies, it goes to -1. And of course, in reality, the index is in between -1 and 1. If the index is equal to 0, the population is equally divided between these two groups. And now we are able to introduce the switching probabilities. So if I am a denier, I don't believe in climate change, there is a probability that I will become a believer, or I will start to support climate policies. And this is probability given equation 2, P minus plus. On the other hand, I might be a believer, and for some reason I change my mind. I start to be against climate policy. So this is the probability plus minus. And these probabilities depend on an index S, that is the sentiment index. And here is how we are going to introduce the fact that the reasoning is context dependent, because sentiments depend on phi. So if the majority of the population supports climate change, and I am against climate policies, if the majority supports, then the probability that I might change my mind increases. On the other hand, if I support climate policies, but I'm surrounded by people that are deniers, the probability that I will become a denier increases. It's not for sure that I will, but the probability that I might change my mind increases. This captures the idea that reasoning is context dependent. How about Porter's hypothesis? So back in the 90s, Porter and Van der Leen, there are two papers. They challenge the view, the idea that there is a trade-off between social benefits and private costs. They actually argue that by stimulating innovation, and strict environmental regulation can actually increase, enhance competitiveness. There are different versions from this law. Empirical studies have mainly found support for the narrow and the weak versions. And how we incorporate these in the model. So we have the following. Equation 4 is telling us that changes in environmental efficiency are going to depend on the stringency of the environmental regulation lambda. And on the other hand, the kind of regulation that the society adopts depend on the attitudes towards climate policies. So if phi is closer to 1, this means that the majority of the population supports climate change, then it's more likely that this society will adopt a regulation that favors the environment. And in this way, you have higher environmental efficiency. The other way around, if the majority of the population is formed by deniers, or let's say that policy influencers, policymakers don't believe in climate change, then they will adopt less stringent environmental regulation, and this will lead to lower or environmental efficiency. Now, what about the production technology? Here we adopt a simple Leontief production function. So we have complementarity between factors of production, and we have two factors of production: energy, E, and labor. And labor multiplied by labor productivity and the rate of employment. And the dynamic Leontief efficiency condition is telling us that the rate of growth of energy, so energy requirements, is going to follow the rate of growth of output. And the rate of growth of output, we know, that is given by the green version of Tirol's law. This model, all the dynamics are in the long run. While the rate of employment, changes in the rate of employment, just respond to the difference between the rate of growth of output and the rate of growth of labor productivity, because the population, to simplify things, was taken as constant. Now, the last behavioral relationship is the rate of growth of labor productivity. That is supposed to be a positive function of the rate of employment. And why is this? Because we recognize the existence of dynamic economies of scale and induced technical change. Dynamic economies of scale, meaning that technical change is embodied, or a significant part of technical change is embodied, comes in the form of a new computer, comes in the form of a new software, and labor needs to use this new equipment, this new software, in order to incorporate the gains in terms of labor productivity. This is one thing. The other thing is that when the rate of employment is high, higher employment increases the bargain power of workers. As the bargain power of workers increases, they are able to get higher increases in real wages relative to labor productivity. This increases the wage share, reduces the profit share, reduces profitability, and firms respond by increasing their search for labor-saving production techniques. So we have an increase in the rate of growth, of labor productivity. Putting all these ingredients together, and after a series of algebraical manipulations, we arrive to a very simple map, to a two-dimensional discrete time system on the rate of employment and on sentiments. And here in this first stage of the exercise, sentiments do not depend on the macroeconomy. The macroeconomy depends on sentiments, but sentiments do not depend on the macroeconomy. We have the following equilibrium conditions. And we're able to prove in a rigorous way a series of existing properties of the model. I'm not going to read them here. I just want to give the economic insight. And the economic insight is the following. If there is mu1 captures the interaction between agents, So if mu1 is low, is sufficiently low, the system admits a unique equilibrium solution, P1. And where P1 is such that phi is equal to 0. What does this mean? This means that if there is little interaction between agents, if agents don't talk, it doesn't matter what they think. If they don't talk, the system generates a unique equilibrium solution when there is polarization in the population. So polarization results from the fact that people are not interacting. If people start to interact, so mu1 keeps increasing, a pitchfork bifurcation is going to occur and is going to give rise to two alternative additional non-trivial equilibrium solutions, P2 and P3. P2 with the majority of the population supporting climate change, P3 with the majority of the population opposing climate change. And P2 will have a higher rate of growth because of Tirol's law, while P3 will have a lower rate of growth, so a Pareto inferior rate of growth. What about the dynamic properties of these equilibrium points? So again, we have a rigorous proposition. I want to show you the economic intuition. Here you have this in this figure. So when there is little interaction between agents, we have a unique equilibrium point that is stable. Once there is enough interaction, a pitchfork bifurcation occurs, and we have two stable equilibrium points in blue and orange. The first equilibrium point is still there, but is unstable. It's an unstable point. If I keep increasing interaction between agents, I will have a series of flip bifurcations, of period doubling bifurcations. They are going to give rise to two chaotic attractors. And I will have coexisting of chaotic attractors. And I can see the coexistence of chaotic attractors here. So for mu1 equal to 1.65, for example, I have in blue one chaotic attractor, and in orange the other chaotic attractor. Depending on initial conditions, I might be in one or the other state. After, if I keep increasing mu1 to 1.66, I have an attractor merging crisis, and these two attractors are going to merge. Here I have the time series, and I can say a little bit about the 5 minutes, great. I can say a little bit about the economic intuition of this, why this result is important. Because we have sensitivity. What a chaotic attractor mean in economic terms? It means sensitivity to initial conditions. It means that the system depicts path-dependent behavior. Two very, very close initial conditions can lead to trajectories extremely different, as we show in these figures. And moreover, sentiments are more volatile than employment. So we have these irregular dynamics in employment, but very long waves, while sentiments are more volatile. We think this is what we observing that. Now, all these dynamics are deterministic. What about if the system is hit by stochastic shocks? Can informational shocks make me move from a bad equilibrium to a good equilibrium? This is important for a policymaker. And what we have is that if shocks are too small, I am not able to change the basing of attraction. So shocks are of little use. But if shocks are too strong, then I just move from one basing of attraction to the other. And the reason for this is that the policymaker does not control how the agent interprets the information. And information is context dependent. So the informational shock, you cannot rely on an informational shock, or at least in our model, you cannot rely on informational shock in order to reach a desirable equilibrium solution. Now, I said that this initial model did not allow for feedback from the economy or from the environment to sentiments. And now we are going to allow this to happen. Define pollution as the ratio between energy and efficiency, environmental efficiency. So higher environmental efficiency is associated with lower pollution, and allow sentiments to depend on pollution, on the degradation of the environment. So if pollution is increasing, the environment is degrading, you have these influences, these impacts, the switching probabilities through the sentiments index. So what is going to happen? After a series of algebraical manipulations, we reach a new dynamical system in which now we have feedback in both directions, from the macroeconomy to sentiments, from sentiments to the macroeconomy, with the environment in the middle. We can prove the following. Again, we have a rigorous proposition that doesn't matter here, but what matters is intuition. As I increase the sensitivity of agents, that is mu2, the sensitivity of agents to pollution, as the sensitivity of agents to pollution increases, the equilibrium P1 and P3 disappear, and I remain only with P2. That is a desirable equilibrium for an environmental point of view, which means that this parameter allows me to arrive to a policy consistent equilibrium point that is Pareto superior. This equilibrium point is possible to show that it is stable under very reasonable conditions. So some final considerations, and I hope, Matthias, I'm on time. we developed a discrete time agent-based model to investigate changes in public opinion regarding climate change in an open economy setup. And we are able to show that the group effect is responsible for generating polarization. So small interaction, we have polarization. High interaction, we might have a desirable equilibrium point. And that the GMG emission effect is responsible for achieving a unique green growth equilibrium. We also provided, I didn't report it here, but we also provided estimations on the Green Tea Rose Law for a sample of 12 OECD countries between 1970 and 2014. Now, what do we have in terms of policy implications? And this is my last slide. We conclude, at least in the light of the model, that scientific literacy is a necessary but not sufficient condition for achieving green growth equilibrium. And a successful communication strategy is conditional upon audience motivation. And this might imply the need for reforming the academic system. So in order to increase trust in the scientific community, we need to allow researchers to communicate their results to the general public. This also might imply that we should not exclude social influencers or religious authorities of the debate, not marginalize them because they reach audiences that science people do not reach. And finally, fighting climate change does not require the public to believe in climate change science. So you might have a Republican voter that does not believe in climate change, does not believe in climate science, but he truly believes that Chinese shouldn't control the green technology. And you might be able to convince him or her using arguments that don't require to believe in climate change science. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marvil. So thank you. We're doing very well on time. So the last paper is actually by myself. I'm gonna, so I started here. I think it will have some sound if I go over time. It will have some bells. So I'll know when to shut up. So this paper is actually something that was the first version of this was written during the summer. The title is Public Debt After the Great Shutdown. Let me share. I'm going to use I suppose the PowerPoint, given that I have it. It's more to provide some. I'm going to show some figures. I'm not going to show the figures of actually of the several simulations that we played with. It's work done with one of my ex-PhD students, Suranjana Nabarbaduri. She did a lot of the calculations for this, and it's relatively simple, in terms of the calculations. So we're in a sense switching here. So from issues of more theoretical issues of growth and long-term perspectives, although I'm going to talk really what I want to talk is it's more long-term sort of issues in a sense to the specific crisis that we're still in, and I think we're still in. So there might be, I suppose there is a lot of optimism and hope. Hope is always good with the vaccines out, but but I think in terms of the macroeconomy of this, there is enough reason for us to be concerned of the long-term impacts of the COVID crisis. So the plan of the talk is more or less that. I'm going to give you a brief sort of discussion of what kind of crisis is. There was sort of a big debate at the beginning. I suppose there still is, but as I was saying, this was written in the summer. I tweaked it a little bit by November. It's been accepted. It's been published in the journal by Mario Secareccia, that he edits. It's the International Journal of Political Economy. So of course things kept changing significantly, and we have many sort of iterations of this. So this is some iteration. And I'm more interested, and I should say the way I see this, I worked, so it does say there, if you care to, and I assume you didn't, but if you care to read the abstract that was sort of uploaded there, it says something about stock flow models. I'm going to say something about that. I did work with wind. This is a very simplified and simplistic version of stock flow. So I'm going to say a few things about that. So, but the idea is to talk a little bit of what kind of crisis we have, to talk a little bit about what recovery we might get. We have a recovery in course, of course, but we still don't know the precise size of the recession. At least for most countries, it seems that it's going to be smaller than people thought, and so I think that there is a misplaced optimism. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and discuss a little bit of the policies that were pursued, and talk what I think it's needed. But in that respect, I want to emphasize sort of long-term trends, things that were that are structural and were there. So in many ways, the main argument is I think that the crisis has reinforced and accelerated trends that had already begun with the 2008 crisis. And those are associated to some extent to things that people tend to see as positive. So a return of fiscal policy. As I was talking with the panel right before this presentation, I did attend the panel organized by Dominic Salvatore, in which you have all of the sort of the ex and current masters of the universe. So you have Carmen Reinhardt from the World Bank, and Raghuram Rajan of ex-IMF and the Reserve Bank of India, and you had Larry Summers of a pact with the devil. No, I mean the Clinton administration and Obama, and you had John Taylor from Bush. So everybody, Stiglitz. And the interesting thing is Stiglitz presented something that was more theoretical about the crisis and how to look at it. And he suggested that we need models that are, disequilibrium models that take into consideration deep or fundamental uncertainty, that the models have failed us, that we should abandon conventional models. And of course, that built into Larry Summers saying that we need a lot of fiscal policy because of some sort of secular stagnation, even if the reasons why he comes with secular stagnation are sort of weird. And I thought, okay, so John Taylor will sort of push back and say, no, that's too much. And even John Taylor said, no, we need more fiscal policy. And so the idea that we need more fiscal policy has become sort of conventional. And even some views of monetary policy, the kinds of monetary policies that have been pursued by all of the chairmen of the Fed, from Bernanke and Janet Yellen, now Treasury Secretary, and or soon to be, and Mr. Powell. All of those, which, as I'll suggest, it's fundamentally to sustain, in many ways, fiscal policy. All of those things have become sort of accepted. But I think that far from meaning a return to, when people say a return to Keynes, some may think and reflect that implies, some sort of return to New Deal era sort of policies, and I joke and played around, and it's still here in the presentation, with the ideas that this new crisis will require more state intervention. Of course, that could mean socialism, but I don't think that that's what we're looking at. So we're looking at add more state intervention, but certainly not a future of socialism. In fact, I think it's timely that Leo Panitch has passed away recently, and he wrote a little book which is lost somewhere here about the defeats of the left, and I think that is appropriate at an URPE panel in which we're talking about growth and financial instability and fiscal policy and income distribution and the environmental crisis, to think also of the several defeats that we might have on all of those several issues, the defeats of the left, that will be associated to that broader sort of category, socialism. So those are the things that really interest me. So very briefly, let me go to, I had spent a long time on this introduction. So what kind of recession? This is a service recession. Gabriel Mathy, that it's in some other, I think, URPE panel at some point, has done beautiful work on this. He has a post blog that I recommend. He's his posts are interesting, and so if you look at the trajectory there for the U.S., there is a a large share now of consumption. If we're talking about here, you had before two models. One has autonomous consumption, the other has autonomous investment. There is some convergence of those two traditions, I suppose, the Kaleckian and the super multiplier traditions. But here you have that a good chunk of consumption now it's on services, and I should say employment. If you look at employment, and I didn't put it here, it's in the paper, also employment in services is a considerably larger sort of proportion of this. So that means that a shock to services has significant implications. Also, this sort of, I actually not in presentation mode, but I think you can see it well this way, so I'll continue passing it this way. It also has implications for income distribution. So this was from Rav Shetty, and he continued to. There is a paper published on this now, so you can. It's on the National Bureau of Economic Research. This was from a presentation in the summer, so I used the New York Times sort of presentation of this. But you can see also that that in that respect there is. So we have an economy that it's more dependent on services, that a greater chunk of the economy is services. And by the way, I think that of course there is a shutdown, it's there in the title. Of course, there is a supply side sort of aspect to the whole crisis, but I think the fundamental thing here in this crisis continues to be the impact on demand. So I do think that this is a demand crisis, by the way. And you have income distribution effects here that are important. So the ability not just to work, to do this that we're doing, that makes us somewhat privileged, and we can talk about the vaccines later. It's also true in terms of what happens in terms of consumption, and as you can see, the rich, obviously spend more money. They have they drive more of the economy than they did before, and you can see here you have by changing consumer spending, and you see that the recovery of the bottom 25 is faster than of the top 25. So the income distribution effect of that, it's sort of harsher. So it means that people that are wealthier cannot go, may stay at home. They tend to change their patterns of consumption. People that are relatively poorer, they have to still go out and work. They have to still consume, and so there is a negative, sort of an additional negative effect if you have a bigger portion of the economy being on services, a more unequal sort of society in which the wealthy can sort of and will take more care in terms of coming back after the recession. So it's not just sending them checks, and we're going to get more checks, I suppose, but whether those checks are going to be spent. And there was a whole sort of discussion of how efficient some of these fiscal measures that we have had were. I'm not here, so the paper, we also discussed the size of those things and differences in, very briefly in footnotes, really, because we had a limited space there for the journal issue, but different sizes in countries and regions and whatnot. I should say Latin America in particular and the US do very poorly in terms of the pandemic itself, and Latin America is one of the worst in terms of the economic impact. So in which the fiscal rescue packages, as I suppose Gabriel was suggesting, because he was talking about fiscal rules that have been sort of in place, even when you have left of center governments in the region. So the packages have, for several reasons. Sometimes it's political, as it is in Brazil. Sometimes it's external restrictions and that renegotiation issues like Argentina and so on and so forth. But for whatever reasons, or sometimes it's political, but weird, like in Mexico. So they cited the big three in the region, but you have significant problems. By the way, probably the largest sort of impact will be in Latin America. So the type of recovery, of course, there is all of this stuff of the V recovery, and I think now there is sort of during the summer there was still some notion that this is going to be a V recovery. I cited here Mark Zandi. Mark Zandi is always cited as chief forecaster. And here I should say something about what we did. So Wynne tended to think of this, Wynne Godley tended to think about this stock flow models that he did as scenarios to think about the possibilities. It wasn't forecasting, so he never thought of those as forecasting. So he thought of those as what he called, the important thing wasn't the size of the parameters, so it wasn't the econometric estimation of the parameters. It wasn't necessarily the size of shocks or what would happen, because all of that is sort of guesswork. So there is fundamental uncertainty, whatever you want to call it. It was about model architecture. So it was, what are the causality issues? So what drove the models was causality. And so that's really what I wanted to think about this. So I obviously suggested at that point that I don't think this is going to be sort of very fast. I think you might have sort of ratcheted effects and whatnot. I think there is now a regained optimism, perhaps as a side effect of both the vaccine and that one of the two sort of terrible viruses that afflicted us is sort of gone, or almost, and that's Trump, not the coronavirus. So there is a certain optimism, I think, and so again, I don't want to talk. My little joke here is that Galbraith had said that forecasting is there to make astrology look serious. Of course, that now could be said about economic forecasting. It could be said about epidemiology. So the thing is that even with the vaccine, if you look at the numbers that we need, which would be it will be sort of like we need like 70–80% of everybody having. And if we think just of the United States, which is sort of a mistake, because of course, people can get, we don't know if people can get reinfected and whatnot. So if we're thinking globally, so even in the U.S., just the U.S., it's by the end of the year, perhaps we'll be lucky to have every 70–80% vaccinated and back to some sort of normality, or at least that's what now it's being said by epidemiologists. And so globally, it seems considerably harder. There is a significant uneven distribution of those vaccines. They will arrive much later, even if you can factor in the other sort of vaccines, not just the American ones, but the Russian, the Chinese, and so on and so forth. So all of those things will play a role. So what we did is a very simple thing. So another thing that people, stock flow models are, there are many stock flow models. Most reasonable macro models are stock flow models. The distinctiveness of Wynne Godley models were, in my view, not so much that they were stock flow, but that they had full accounting. So everything was sort of accounted, where it started and when it ended. And we don't do this in this model, so I should say. So this is a very simplistic sort of model. What we calculated was playing around with a simple multiplier, not a super multiplier, a simple multiplier story. So we have some estimates of that and play around with those. A simple regularity associated to the Okun's law. So how much changes in spending affect output multiplier, how much effects of output affect productivity and hence employment, and you get an Okun's law. And we also played a simple sort of stock flow rule. So just a simple stock flow rule in this case is, if you run some deficits, and we also have some sort of notions of tax incidence. So if you spend and how much you increase output and how much impact it has on employment and how much that leads to a deficit, and the deficit, how much it accumulates into a debt. And so you see that the deficits have been large. So this is retrospective, not going forward. We didn't make calculations of those, and you see here the monetary sort of impact. You see here the effect of the Great Recession. You see that the balance sheet of the Fed sort of increased, never went down. If you go to my blog, Naked Keynesianism, I have the little thing that says Naked Keynes there. So I wrote around here that this sort of unwinding of this wouldn't work out, and effectively did, and I think that this came to stay. So these sort of larger deficits are here to stay. That implies larger debts. this will imply a larger proportion of those held by the Fed. The Fed has become sort of the fiscal agent of the government, something that it was originally. So that's what central banks were created to be. It's worth remembering. It's what they also became again in the 1930s. Fundamentally, that's the sort of changes in the essential changes actually in the monetary sort of regulation during the New Deal. And so those were already happening. And I should say other stuff that was happening is that we have moved, away from the notion that globalization can solve all our problems. Of course, that was reflected in the case of the United States on Trump's arguments against China. So you can think without the xenophobia, not xenophobia, there is that too, but the xenophobia, so the phobia against China that he had, you can think of the trade wars as being a reflection of that. But I think even on the left, there was, and in general, so the rise of something like Bernie and the left in the United States reflects this sort of understanding that globalization has failed, and so I think those trends were already there. So I think that one of the things, if you listen to Carmen Reinhardt on that roundtable that I told you, she said that essentially what the COVID crisis did is accelerate trends that were already there. I think she's right on that. So she quoted the important one for her is the movement towards a more xenocentric world in which a larger share of GDP would be in China. We may have a discussion of what's the implication of that for the hegemonic position of the United States. I have like 30 seconds, so I'm going to finish with this. She did say, at least in one area, that she thinks that the United States position is relatively safe, and that's the position of the dollar. I think that she's correct on that too. But I think that what we have here changes that imply a larger role for the state. So we will have fiscal policies back. So we're going to have large deficits, and that will imply relatively larger levels of debt. All my simulations that really balloons in the next 10 years, and it takes a while, and most of them to have a situation in the labor market in terms of just the Yoko and multiplier effects of fiscal policy, to get a situation in which the employment situation and with reasonable participation rates is reasonably good. I should say this has been sort of a crisis that has had also a significant impact on gender and race and ethnicity. In the U.S., very differential sort of effects. And so that's worth noticing. I couldn't explore that here, but those trends now with this with COVID also come with an understanding that I think that the role of the state has to go beyond, and that some degree of planning. So if 2008, 2009 brought back the idea of fiscal policy, sure, how Keynesian, this crisis brought back the idea that markets do fail, and that you need some degree of planning, and that the government should intervene on things like trade and the production of certain essential goods and so on and so forth. However, I don't think that necessarily means that we're going to have very progressive outcomes. I'm sure that there's space for us to discuss those in the comments. I'm already over my time, so I'll shut up and stop sharing, and we'll open up for questions, comments, or responses if anybody wants to say something. I don't know if the audience can sort of, I think you can certainly the audience can add questions in the Q&A, which I don't see any, but the audience, I'm not sure you guys can unmute yourselves. So if I may then, so I think given my privilege here as the chair of the panel, what I'll do, we have enough time. We have about 30 minutes. If my clock is right. And by the way, so once we get that, we get kicked out. So there is no, I have a few sort of comments, questions that I may sort of bring up. And if you guys want to sort of respond, that would be sort of good. So, first of all, for Joanna, I was thinking, so I don't know if you read the, so every time now I'm very much, sort of like the kind of discussion you're having. So you're having a discussion in which debt has a sort of important implications. Private debt consumption, has significant implications for recovery and whatnot, and for explaining some of these crises. Of course, this was a very popular discussion of, say, the Great Recession in 2008. So that's traditionally one of the ways of looking at that. I always suggest that the one way of looking at what Keynes' contribution is if you look at chapter 19 of the General Theory, although it doesn't appear before in the text, he has all of this discussion about the impact of debt on essentially what's that deflation on spending, both of in terms of investment and consumption in that chapter. So one of the things he's saying is, look, we have now an economy that used to be an economy, the Victorian era, that was sort of somewhat self-regulated, perhaps not like neoclassical authors think, but it was self-regulated. And all of a sudden you have huge amounts of debt, and now deflation, because it has, and in those situations maybe the Pigou effect, and well, it doesn't have the Pigou, the Keynes effect, sort of works, and you have a system that it's tending to full employment. That's gone. Now you have all of this debt deflation, sort of income distribution effects, and you go away. But there's this interesting work by Josh Mason that shows that a lot of the changes in debt have been associated to changes in the rate of interest, and that actually there's not much impact on consumption of that. And so I don't know if you read that, and if you did, how would you? This is less about your model, I'm sorry to say, and more about the sort of policy implications of what this kind of models suggest. For Gabriel, I was thinking the following thing. You cited Cesarato, so this is again somewhat orthogonal to what you were saying, but Cesarato says, something about the social wage, and that reminded me. I don't know if you ever read, but there is a whole literature on this in the 70s and 80s, and there is a really good paper by Ahmed Tonak and Anwar Sheikh on what they call the myth of the social wage. And in part is because they do suggest that if you look at traditionally who paid for the welfare state, it was the working class. So the working class was taxed away as, so the state spent more, which to some extent you're doing that in your model, but who's paying for that is the working class itself. And they suggest that any reasonable sort of discussion of a social wage has to take into consideration who is paying for that. So if it's the worker itself, workers themselves that are paying for that, it shouldn't be considered social wage. It's just a different method of extraction of surplus. So thought it was worth mentioning in this context. I think it's apropos. Then for Marvel, I'll actually have So one thing is you say that reasoning is context dependent, and we have questions, so I'm going to read those after I finish, so we're accumulating some. So reasoning is context dependent, but it's also, it seems to me that it's positively affected by average views. So you tend to, there is sort of an attractor that makes, some sort of positions that become majoritarian or are somewhat majoritarian or increasing in, with interactions to become sort of more relevant. I don't disagree that might be the case. So that might very well be the case. I mean, I think one of the interesting things is how fast politicians, even progressive politicians, that they knew better, people like Obama, rapidly evolved in their views about, say, LGBTQ sort of, gay marriage or whatever. His views evolved pretty fast, and it seems that they evolved because society views, the average views, sort of move fast. So I'm not necessarily disagreeing with you, but I think that that's also implicit in your model. that those views are sort of unattractive, so that the average view, or perhaps I'm wrong. The thing I have more trouble with is that you say that macroeconomics is dependent on sentiments, but not vice versa. And that's one that I think, if anything, there's a famous phrase I quote it very often by Mariner Eccles, the chairman of the Fed, from 35 effectively, because when that position is created until 48 when Truman resigns him, and he says that confidence is not the cause, it's the result. And so I'm always, so how much of those, so how much can, so there's certainly cases in which the average drives and whatnot, but there are cases in which actually is the opposite. And so I'm missing that sort of interaction. And I don't know if that's something you can introduce in your model, but that would be sort of an interesting thing. Let me read I think we have 2 questions. So let me read one. It seems for Gabriel, sorry, and the other I think it's for me. So I'm going to read both, and then I'll open up this. So a question for Gabriel. Maybe I misunderstood him. Is Pivetti arguing that the central bank can set the rate of profit by setting the short-term interest rate, nominal interest rate? This is from Ivan Velasquez. Antonio, sorry I joined very late. You mentioned ballooning debt in 10 years in your calculations. What about conditions under which large stocks of that may become feasible in the G plus R sort? So we have those 2 to start with. So if you, those 2 plus my sort of general, comments. So if you want to go around again, Joanna, and then Gabriel, and then Marvel, and I'll talk a little bit more. And if we.
Well, thank you. Well, I mean, yeah, it's true because of the way these models work so far. What I did was I assumed that this credit finance consumption is just exogenous, and I don't really go deep into explaining what is it related to. And so I didn't really look at this relationship between consumption, credit finance consumption, and interest rates. But it is something that I'm actually been working on, trying to not just assume it as exogenous, as like really trying to look at it and explain it better. But because this paper was more focusing on sort of the financial sustainability aspect of it, I didn't look at how interest rates could change consumption. But I think it's an interesting aspect, and I think it's, thank you for the comment.
Thank you, Matthias, for your comments. Well, I kind of look at this literature on social wages, a very broad literature, Marxist literature, let's say. Well, it's not in the center of my paper's argument. It's just one of the possibilities. And I must emphasize something. I don't know if I was clear about that. I didn't try to provide a normative view on public policy, and I think this is very related to what I understand as using the classical surplus approach to assess state interventions, is that we don't have a normative view. We know we try to test the channels by which the state will stimulate or not accumulation, and we move the distribution towards workers or capitalists. That's what we do with this kind of model, right, and this kind of approach. And I think that the situation you just described of the workers being taxed in order to pay for the welfare system, let's say, for the social wage, it's completely possible in my model. If I assume that the tax incidence lay over the workers, the real wage instead of firms, I must just say that perhaps I think this literature in the 70s talking much more about income taxes on profits and wages, or social security contributions, which are more, well, social security contributions are called indirect tax as well, but they are more direct tax in the sense that it comes out of the wage earned by workers. In the case of indirect taxation, it occurs in the process of sales and productions of firms, right? And of course, if the tax incidence is on workers, of course the social wage won't change anything. It's just another way of keeping constant the normal rate of profit. It's just that. Well, it's a choice coming from the government, and it reflects the difference bargaining power in society, right? And talking about rate of profit, the questions are from Ivan Velasquez. Well, I don't know if I'm being too obvious, but the idea of the monetary theory of distribution comes directly from Zrafa, who mentions that in his system, instead of having exogenous real wage, we can have an exogenous real interest rate coming from monetary policy. It's not that monetary policy determines directly the normal rate of profit, but it's much more a reference to the determination of the rate of profit. And remember, I should remember that it's the real rate of interest. So it depends on the interaction with wages and prices. And here in my work, I use that in the sense that even Pivetti considers a second component for the rate of profit, which is the profit of enterprise, which is not related at all to the monetary policy. So I hope I could clarify a bit the question. Thank you.
So about the points you raised, thank you again, Matthias. I think, well, I would like to start saying that we can have as many agents as we want in the model. So we have two agents because it's very intuitive to have like a group that supports and a group that opposes. I could have three, a group of indifferent. I could have five, a group that supports a lot, a group that supports little. I mean, it increases the complexity of the model. We keep it two agents because it's quite intuitive. Having said that, reason is context dependent, yes, and is definitely influenced by the averaging, as you said. So I completely agree with your first statement. It's influenced by the average, and this is one of the mechanisms that sustains the additional equilibrium points when there is sufficient interaction. Because if you have sufficient interaction and you are in equilibrium where the majority of the population supports climate change, the average supports climate change. And this is what makes it's more difficult for you to change your view. And the same thing or analogous thing happens if you are in equilibrium with the majority of the population opposes climate change, then the average opposes climate change, and it becomes more difficult that a single agent switches views. Okay, so that was the first point, and I agree with you. The second point is about the macro depends on sentiments, but not vice versa. That was true only in the first model, and that was the first step in the exercise. So the first model, we don't have the feedback, but then in the second model, we allow for the feedback, and this feedback that gives us the result that only the good equilibrium remains. So this was to emphasize that channel that you are saying, oh, I think that channel is important. Indeed, that channel is very important because through that channel, P2, that is the Pareto superior equilibrium, is the only equilibrium sustained. So yeah, so thank you. Do we have chance to ask questions to other?
Oh, yes, by all means. I have two questions. I'll be very brief. So by all means, if you guys want also to jump in, we have one more question, Kathy Foreman, that it's for me, from Matthias Rengo. You mentioned that the lockdown will lead to, I don't know if everybody can read them, but yeah. So I'll read it out loud. You mentioned that the lockdown will lead to socialism because of more planning, in particular healthcare. What form of where you think planning would take, and would there be government control or influence over industry? So let me very briefly go over the first one, which was about, if you recall, let me read it fast again. You mentioned ballooning debt in 10 years in your calculations. What about conditions under which large stocks of debt may become feasible because growth is faster than the rate of interest? So first of all, we do have growth larger than the rate of interest, simply because we have the rate of interest on the floor for the most, for all of our sort of, so this is not because of the dynamics of that does not come from a negative sort of, or if you want, the unstable side of the downward, condition. It comes from the fact that so there is in almost all my sort of assumptions, there is this notion, which is sort of tucked in there in the PowerPoint, but certainly in the paper, that I don't think we're going to have, despite all of the talk of fiscal policy and despite the sort of large deficits, and despite the fact that the fiscal package was relatively large, if you think in terms of the size of fiscal packages in the US, the initial one of 2 trillion was sort of big, but we're already reverted to what, 900 billion. And we'll see what happens in Atlanta, in Georgia, and with the elections for the Senate. But even if, let's say, the best possible scenario, and the Democrats get the Senate by a razor thin margin, plus having the House, the expectations for a very strong sort of spending sort of push by the government, it's I think unlikely, even though I suggested that everybody all of a sudden is very Keynesian and they talk, oh, Keynes came back and planning came back. So this is a little bit of hypocrisy. So I do think that we're not going to get a lot of spending. So with that, what happens is, given multiplier effects and Okun effects, we do have that inevitably, the tax revenue doesn't come back as much, and so that's a result, and we end up with large deficits. So the large deficits are, to some extent, the consequence of an economy that is, as Summer says, stagnating, but not for the reasons he thinks. So it's not because a natural rate of interest is lower. It's not demographics. It's exactly because we have bouts of financial fragility that lead to as Joanna was talking at the beginning, followed by relatively mild expansions, and that leads as a good sort of reply to the second. So that's the reason for the accumulating debts. To the second question, so I think we're going to have more spending on healthcare. I'm not saying necessarily that and a good chunk of that will come from the states. So the state, the United States, as far as I understand so far, this vaccine will be rolled out. I would assume that the state will pay for a good chunk of that. I'm not suggesting necessarily. So there will be more planning, simply for reasons. I mean, at the end of the day, who did this? Even with Trump, think of that. Even with Trump, the degree of incompetence and idiocy, it's there. You can listen to the tapes of him, talking with the guy in Georgia. It's abysmal. And yet, there is Operation Warp Speed, $18 billion spent. They're producing not far from here in Baltimore huge amounts of this vaccine. The Moderna one with significant amounts of money provided by the government. So there is a developmental state in the United States, and the Pentagon is concerned about this vaccine. So the 2 American vaccines tend to be more effective than the Chinese one. All of this, so if you're a chauvinist and are concerned with those nationalistic things, Tyler Cohen had said that this proves that the United States is ahead on the fight with for hegemonic power with China, and so on and so forth. So I do think we're going to have more planning. I don't really think socialism. So what I'm saying is that if you think that planning is socialism, and that somehow we don't trust markets, is an implication that we're going to have socialism. So we're going to have something along those lines. But I don't think it's necessarily a retreat of neoliberalism in many ways, or particularly the sorts of outcomes progressives sort of want. So I'm it was a little bit in jest, so that I suggested that, and I think the important thing is that I think a great majority of the population wants that, and so that's what behind Bernie and all of those things. So it is surprising, the inability, because the system is rigged in many ways, to win, even though the vast majority wants Medicare for all, and you can go down the line and payment of debts, college debt, and so on and so forth, suggests that the danger, like in the 30s, is not so much socialism, it's fascism. So at any rate, Marvel, or any of you, or if anybody else wants to sort of ask questions by all means.
Ladies first, Joanna, I don't know if you, otherwise okay. So, so first regarding Joanna's presentation, I was wondering, as a clarification, I don't know if there's going to be time for answering, but I just wanted to tell you. So I was a little bit confused if the model is a discrete model or a continuous model, because in the paper, in the presentation, there was the subscript T, but then you were saying differential equation, so I wasn't sure if it's discrete or continuous. But in any case, if you're interested in instability in these kind of models that take into account distributive conflict, etc., I was wondering why not a growth cycle approach, or an approach that allows for endogenously stability but not explosive stability. And Goodwin is kind of the obvious names, but there are people working with household debt, and something that you are doing. For example, Grasselli is doing stuff like that, and I was kind of missing for the presentation, or at least for the literature review. And for Gabriel's paper, Gabriel's presentation, at some point in one of your conditions, you say that it's necessary to sustain the result that the marginal propensity to consume plus the tax is less than 1. So CW plus TW is less than 1. And if this condition is not satisfied, you don't have that result. But if this condition is satisfied, you have the result. But my impression is that this condition is always satisfied, because the marginal propensity to consume, if this condition is not satisfied, it means that all the income of the worker, I mean, how can this condition not be satisfied? So maybe something to think about. I'm not sure if I was clear about the condition. Is CW plus TW less than 1? And my impression is that this condition is always satisfied. Thank you.
Should I go first, I guess? Well, first of all, in terms of the instability analysis, yeah, it's true. I should. Well, I mean, I'm still working on sort of the literature review, and definitely I can mention the Goodwin models. But in terms of why I thought of using the models that I'm using, it's, I think, to also sort of prove a point that the system, the way that it is, does generate instability. So the fact that I run into a result that has instability, I don't see it as a problem itself. So in that sense, like, I think that there's an interesting aspect into it as well. So it's not necessarily a problem that I want like get rid of, like a model that generates financial instability. It's not necessarily a problem in itself. So that's why I didn't see it as a problem. But yeah, it's true that I should, I will include a little bit more of the Goodwin literature, because they do, there's interesting contributions in that sense. And in terms of the time, sorry, yeah, it's continuous time, the model that I used it. But it's true that I started with discrete, and then, yeah, sorry about that. I will make my slides a little bit clearer, sorry.
Thank you, Marvin. Thank you for your comment. I must say, first of all, that since it's a work in progress, I'm still working on these conditions that generates the result I am discussing. The one you mentioned is the result of the derivative of the DP of epsilon in relation to an increase in relation to the indirect tax rate, right? So the point is the economic interpretation for the mathematical result is the following. When I increase, in that case, you have always to remember that in my exercise, I make several assumptions regarding the behavior of profits and the fiscal policy. So in that case, the normal rate of profit is fixed for any reason you want. I'm just considering that situation as relevant one. And the government is following a balanced budget, right? So spending equals revenues. Government spending equals revenues. In that case, I'm saying that an increase in the tax rate, indirect tax rate, which since the normal rate of profit is given, it will be charged on wages, on real wages. So the wage share, since productivity is constant in the simple model, the wage share will fall. Since the wage share will fall, the condition I need to ensure that the rise in the tax burden will be will stimulate the level of output, as in the balanced budgets multipliers. I need to consider that the propensity of workers' consumption has to be small, as well as the income tax on wages, because the income tax on wages will fall, the tax burden on wages will fall because the wage share is falling. So it will affect government spending as well. Remember, D equals T all the time. So I interpret this result as saying that the propensity to consume out of wages and the tax rate on wages have to be small enough. You are saying that they are always below unity. The point is in that
the sum is always less than 1.
Yeah, but the point is, I'm not. It's not CW times the wage share. It's just the CW. You see, and I'm not sure about, because I was looking at some data. When I'm building the model, I'm always looking at real data to check if it makes sense at all. But I will certainly check with that. But I was not sure about it. Thank you, but thank you for your comment.
We've got 5 minutes left, really. I did reply. Thank you, Kathy, for your additional comment. I did reply in writing to that. Let me, sort of first say, we're concluding here. So let me first say that, there are many other URPE sessions still there. So if you, if you participated in this one, if you presented a paper, please do go to the other sessions. I don't know how the ASSA, the American Economics, the Allied Social Sciences, Association does manage, those participations, but they normally in the regular, in-person conference do come and check how many people are in the room. We had at some point, without the panel, and without the tech person, 23, I think. Please do help participate to the extent that you can in other URPE sessions. There are many sort of good ones. I also want to thank the panelists, for your presentations. And I do hope that you get those published, and that you consider the review of radical political economics. There is the not just the conference issue, but as a general one. So going back to Marville here, and to conclude with that idea, so networking and interactions do matter, and so this is part of the networking and the interactions between sort of left of center, progressive, heterodox, radical sort of groups, and despite all of the talk by many mainstream people rediscovering ideas that that have been sort of repeated by heterodox groups for a long time, I think that they seldom do recognize those and or provide spaces. So I think it's important that we fight to preserve those spaces. So thank you, everybody. I think we have 3 minutes. I don't know if you guys want to say something.
Just thank you again, Matthias, and all that.
Okay. Well, I'll see you guys. Hopefully next year in Boston. Jesus, who wants to go to Boston in January? But Chicago turned out to be okay. So we'll hopefully see you. I think we need that. To see people live. I'm gonna have a beer. So it's the appropriate time somewhere. So in Italy. So Marvel can have a beer.
Sure, I shall have it for you guys. Well, and I hope to see Matthias before next year, because if I only see you next year, is a problem.
Okay, well, see you all, guys. We have now less than 2 minutes to go. There is a new question, but I don't think we will have time to. Oh no, it's just a comment by Jeff. Thanks, everyone. Excellent panel. Thank you. Thank you for everybody that was here until the end. So thank you very much.